The morning air inside the Capitol felt like heavy glass, clear but ready to shatter. Karoline Leavitt stood alone at the podium, eyes locked on the row of Democratic lawmakers who'd just finished their press conference. At the front of them stood Hakeem Jeffries, still dabbing his eyes dramatically from a speech he'd just delivered about January 6th. It had been laced with emotion, but to Karoline, it felt manufactured. She didn't wait for her turn. She took it. "There's a difference between crying for cameras," she said, her voice cutting through the murmur of press, "and crying for a country you're destroying." Heads turned. Jeffries didn't. Karoline pulled out a folder marked DHS Brief, Southern Border Breach. She lifted it high above the mic. "While you wept over one day, I was on the phone with Border Patrol, begging for answers about 87,000 illegal entries in 1 month." Reporters' fingers froze on their keyboards. No one had expected this. Jeffries half-turned, lips tight. "This isn't about immigration," he said, attempting calm. Karoline stepped forward. "That's exactly the problem. It should be." She wasn't done. "You claim to defend democracy, yet you're silent while this administration lets cartels traffic children across our borders like currency." A low gasp moved through the chamber. Cameras panned back and forth like predators sensing blood. Jeffries shook his head as if trying to move past her, both literally and politically. But Karoline didn't flinch. "I lost a friend last year, Congressman," she said, voice quieter now. "He was hit by someone who shouldn't have been in this country. You had no tears for him, just silence." And then she uttered the line that would be replayed on every screen in America that night. "You cried for January 6th, but you stayed silent on open borders. That's not leadership. That's cowardice in a suit." The silence that followed was unlike anything Capitol Hill had felt in years. Jeffries turned, slowly, but Karoline was already holding up a photo. The man in it was smiling. His name was Charlie. "Say his name," she said. The press didn't just report it, they exploded it. Karoline didn't blink, not when Jeffries scowled, not when his aides began motioning toward the exit. The speaker pro temp stepped in, tried to restore order, tried to regain control of the optics. But control was already gone. Karoline had shattered it with one line. "You cried about January 6th, she repeated louder now. "But you're silent on what's happening today. Americans are dying, and you care more about your party's image than their lives." Jeffries whispered something to an aide. Another Democrat, Congresswoman Delia Ramirez, interrupted. "This is not your time to speak, Miss Leavitt." Karoline turned, eyes ice-cold. "Then whose time is it? Yours? While women are dragged across our border, while fentanyl floods our streets, while families bury teenagers who never made it to 20. Her voice didn't shake. It carved through the rot. "This isn't a speech, it's a reckoning." She walked toward the front row where the media was seated. Several reporters leaned forward, unsure whether to film, photograph, or take cover. She dropped a folder, thick, unmarked, onto the press table. "This is everything they don't want you to read. Victim names, arrest reports, ICE suppression memos, all dated within the last 90 days. Jeffries stood still, arms folded, trying to ride it out like a storm. But Karoline wasn't lightning. She was thunder, and it kept coming. "You call me extreme?" she snapped. "I call you complicit. Every time you dodge the truth to protect this administration, you abandon the people who trusted you." Someone in the room whispered, "She's going viral right now." Another reporter quietly turned their phone vertical and hit record. Karoline looked directly into a camera. "This isn't about Trump. It's not about January 6th. It's about today. You're crying over history while ignoring blood on the streets. This week." Then she said the line that landed like a body blow. "You can't cry on cue and claim moral authority, especially when your silence is killing Americans." It wasn't just a confrontation anymore. It was a political earthquake. Jeffries finally spoke. "Miss Leavitt, We don't conduct hearings through sensationalism. This chamber deserves decorum. Decorum. Karoline's jaw tightened, not in anger but in disbelief. Decorum, she echoed. Is that what you call it when you ignore dead children in border towns because they don't fit your narrative? The silence in the room turned volatile. Even some Democratic staffers looked away. You want to talk about decorum? Karoline continued. Then where was your outrage when 200,000 illegals crossed in a single month? Where was your press conference when a 12-year-old was found unconscious in a cartel stash house in El Paso? Jeffries tried to reset. We're here to work toward unity. Unity? Karoline cut him off. You've spent years branding half this country as extremists. You labeled parents at school board meetings as domestic terrorists. You locked down speech, censored questions, and called disagreement a threat to democracy. And now you talk about unity? Her words sliced through the hypocrisy like glass. Jeffries shifted, trying to recalibrate. This kind of rhetoric endangers our institutions. That was it. Karoline walked forward again, this time slower. No, Congressman. What endangers our institutions is the lie you've built around them. You cry over a broken window on Capitol Hill but ignore broken bodies in Texas. She looked around. You want America to unite? Then start by telling the truth. Then she pulled out the photo. A printed image of a young girl, face bruised, eyes wide. Her name was Maricela. She died during a smuggler's run after Biden's parole program collapsed in chaos. She's not a talking point. She's a victim of your border policies. Jeffries took a breath, but said nothing, because there was nothing to say. Karoline didn't just challenge the narrative. She dismantled it, brick by brick, and everyone watching knew it. Jeffries had entered that room with the power. But Karoline had walked in with the truth, and that power was far stronger. The chamber had turned still, not silent, still, a kind of frozen energy like the moment before lightning hits the ground. Karoline unfolded something from her file. It wasn't a document, it wasn't a report. It was a small, worn American flag, creased, sun-bleached, with a single bullet hole through the corner. She raised it. This flag flew outside an Arizona ranch, she said. The man who lived there, Alan Sutter, was a Vietnam vet. He was shot through his front door when cartel traffickers mistook him for a threat. Jeffries blinked. The air had thickened. Karoline didn't shout. She didn't need to. Her voice came steady, measured like a blade. He didn't die in Kabul. He didn't die in Fallujah. He died on his porch because the government that sent him to war left the front gate wide open. She paused. Let it sink in. And you want to talk about January 6th? Several people stirred in their seats. Journalists were scrambling, some texting, some just staring. The power dynamic had flipped entirely. Karoline turned to the panel. Let me be crystal clear, she said. January 6th was wrong. Violence at the Capitol was wrong. But don't insult the American people by pretending that was the only violence that mattered. She looked directly at Jeffries again. You built your career on pretending the border crisis was a right-wing illusion. But I've met the families who sleep with rifles because the police can't reach them. I've walked through towns where every house has been hit, not by hurricanes, but by fentanyl. The room was holding its breath. Karoline stepped back and placed the flag down, carefully, almost like a burial. Then she turned once more. You want accountability, Congressman, she said. Start by opening your eyes. Jeffries didn't move, because for the first time that day, he had no place to hide. Karoline didn't wait for applause. She didn't need the echo chamber. Her words had already cut straight through the silence. Jeffries was still frozen. His fingers tapped against the table just once, but it was enough. Karoline turned toward him, eyes locked like a soldier scanning the battlefield. You cried on the House floor about January 6th, she said sharply. You wept on television, said democracy nearly died that day. She leaned forward. But when the border breaks, when Americans die from fentanyl you helped ignore, there's not a tear to be found. No speeches, no walkouts, just silence and sound bites. Jeffries raised a brow but said nothing. The cameras caught every twitch, every restrained response. Karoline didn't flinch. Let's talk about who's actually inciting division. Because while you were calling half the country terrorists, I was visiting a family in El Paso who lost their teenage son to a drug dealer from Sinaloa. She placed a photo on the table. It was a high school graduation picture. A boy in a cap and gown, smiling wide. His name was Lucas Mendoza. His mother works 3 jobs. His dad served in Iraq. And you want to lecture me about democracy? Reporters leaned closer. Microphones picked up every syllable. Karoline didn't blink. You want to criminalize speech. I want to defend it. You wave January 6th like a weapon. I hold up the Constitution like a shield. Jeffries finally spoke, but it was weak. No one is denying border issues exist. Karoline cut him off, not with volume, but precision. You denied it for years, Congressman, and now Americans are dying from your denial. She tapped the photo gently. Lucas didn't storm the Capitol. He didn't wear a red hat. He just wanted to graduate. She looked around the room. And thanks to your cowardice, he never got the chance. Silence fell again, but it wasn't the awkward kind. It was fear, because Karoline hadn't just shown truth. She made them live it. The photo of Lucas Mendoza still lay on the table, unmoving, but its presence was louder than any protest chant. Karoline didn't sit down. She didn't need a podium or permission. The Constitution was her platform now, and the truth her megaphone. You know what makes January 6 dangerous, Mr. Jeffries? She asked, pacing with purpose. It's not what happened. It's how you used it. He looked confused. That was her opening. You used it to silence dissent, to label political opponents as extremists, while the real extremism, the cartel-driven chaos pouring across the border, you ignored like it didn't fit the narrative. Gasps rippled through the press seats. Karoline didn't flinch. You weaponized tragedy. I weaponized truth. Jeffries leaned into his mic. You're politicizing a young man's death. She spun toward him, eyes burning. Don't you dare. You sat in silence while families begged for help. You turned your back while Border Patrol agents were overrun. While 100,000 Americans OD'd on fentanyl last year alone. She picked up Lucas's photo and held it high. You were busy tweeting hashtags and fundraising off fear. Even some Democrats in the room looked away. You say you care about democracy? Then explain this. Why does my First Amendment right to speak terrify you more than gangs walking through Eagle Pass? Jeffries remained still, like a man caught without cover in a storm of facts. Karoline's voice softened but didn't weaken. Lucas Mendoza had dreams. He wanted to be a firefighter. He never even got to apply. You didn't protect him with your speeches. Your silence killed him. And then she turned to the cameras. If this Congress won't speak for families like his, I will. Loud, clear, and unstoppable. At that moment, it didn't matter what Jeffries said next, because America had already picked up her words, and they were spreading like fire. The moment Karoline stood on the Capitol steps, microphone in hand, the wind changed. What had started as a single voice, bold, unfiltered, was now echoing across a nation that felt abandoned. News crews scrambled. Protesters quieted. Even some Democrats, including a few behind Jeffries, looked shaken. Let's talk about borders, Karoline said, eyes locked on the cameras, not the politicians watching her from behind their barricades. Let's talk about the border you pretend doesn't exist, because when you had the chance to secure it, you chose optics. You chose theatrics. You chose silence. Jeffries didn't speak. His team stood frozen. But Karoline kept going. No notes, no teleprompter, just fury sharpened into facts. In January of this year alone, she continued, we had over 250,000 illegal crossings. That's more than the population of Buffalo, New York. And where were you, Mr. Jeffries? You were tweeting about equity, about empathy. But when American ranchers begged for help, when fentanyl poured through open checkpoints, when our veterans died homeless while shelters filled with non-citizens, you said nothing. A murmur grew in the crowd. Behind the cameras, murmurs turned to claps. She pointed behind her to the stone building. That building behind me is not your theater. It's not a stage for your slogans. It belongs to the American people, the ones who work, who bleed, who bury their children without hashtags or headlines. She took a breath. Her voice steadied even more. You cried about January 6th, Mr. Jeffries. You called it a dark day. But what about the parents whose daughters were killed by cartel runners? What about the mothers burying their sons after drug overdoses? What about Charlie Kirk? She held up a photo, the same one she'd carried in her jacket pocket. Charlie's face full of hope and grit. He sounded the alarm before anyone listened. He begged this Congress, your Congress, to act. You ignored him. Now he's gone, and you still haven't said his name. A chant started in the crowd. Say his name. Say his name. And Karoline didn't stop it. She lowered the photo and looked directly into the camera. The blood is on your hands, not because you pulled the trigger, but because you watched the gates break and stood by smiling. You failed the country you swore to protect. Inside the Capitol, reports later revealed, Jeffries had retreated into his office, refusing all press. Outside, Karoline didn't retreat. She stood taller. In that moment, she wasn't just confronting a congressman, she was confronting a system. And millions were watching. The footage of Karoline's fiery takedown exploded online. Within an hour, it had been clipped, captioned, and viewed over 10 million times across platforms. But while the digital world erupted in applause or outrage, the real ripple effect was happening behind closed doors. Congressional aides whispered about it in elevators. Journalists rewrote their headlines. And in a hastily called backroom meeting, Jeffries sat silent, fists clenched as one of his advisors stammered, "Sir, we may need to issue a response. The optics." But Karoline didn't wait for optics. She knew what came next had to be louder than the spin. She walked straight from the Capitol steps to the families. The parents of border victims, the widows of fallen officers, the veterans who had been pushed aside for policies that coddled criminals and rewarded chaos. She met them in a modest church hall just blocks away. No cameras, no press, just folded chairs and folded hands. When she walked in, silence fell. A mother stood up, trembling. "My son died from fentanyl. They told me it was just a crisis we're managing. That's what they said." Karoline didn't offer a politician's nod. She didn't say, "I understand," or give her talking points. Instead, she reached for the woman's hand and said, "They call this compassion, but it's cowardice." Murmurs of agreement followed. Then another father spoke, then another. One after another, stories spilled, raw, undigested grief from citizens who felt erased in their own country. And as they spoke, Karoline listened. Not as a candidate, as a daughter of the same America that had failed them. Then she stood again. "You are not forgotten," she said, "and I will not let them pretend you are statistics. You are the reason I walked up those steps. You are the reason I stood before the cameras. And you are the reason I am not done." Outside, protesters had started to shift. Some holding signs against her were now watching her clips online. Debates sparked on sidewalks. Was she just grandstanding, or was she right? And in one viral moment that would later be replayed on every network, an MSNBC host tried to pivot away from her speech. "Well, she's being emotional," he muttered on air. But Karoline's team had the clip ready, juxtaposed with facts, charts, and the names of those who had died. Within minutes, the MSNBC anchor was trending, not for silencing her, but for underestimating her. Karoline hadn't just made a point. She had ignited a reckoning, and the storm was just beginning. The next morning, Capitol Hill wasn't the same. Karoline's confrontation had pierced through the media bubble, slicing past party spin and touching something deeper. Truth. It wasn't polished, it wasn't pretty, but it was undeniable. CNN tried to salvage Jeffrey's image. They aired a segment titled "The Real Story Behind the Border Crisis," filled with sanitized numbers and carefully selected sound bites. But it backfired. Viewers flooded the comments. Why didn't you show Karoline's full speech? Why are you defending silence? Tell the truth for once. Even inside his own caucus, Jeffries felt the walls closing in. Younger Democrats, once loyal, now raised eyebrows behind closed doors. One aide leaked a memo. Avoid responding directly to Levitt. Too high risk. Her facts are airtight. Meanwhile, Karoline moved fast. She didn't wait for pundits to catch up. That afternoon, she walked back into the Capitol. Not with a camera crew, but with a stack of folders. Names, photos, timelines. People the administration had ignored. She placed them on the desk of the House Oversight Committee. "These are not talking points," she said to the stunned committee staffer. "These are Americans." Outside, a reporter caught her. "Karoline, do you have a response to Congressman Jeffrey's office calling your rhetoric dangerous?" She turned, deadpan. "What's dangerous," she said, "is ignoring grieving parents. What's dangerous is calling silence leadership. What's dangerous is a border wide open while veterans sleep on concrete." The clip hit 8 million views in 3 hours. That evening, Jeffries held a press conference. The plan was damage control, but it turned into disaster. He fumbled his statements, contradicted himself twice, and mispronounced the name of a border town mentioned in Karoline's speech. A reporter asked, "Congressman, why did you vote to send $3 billion abroad last quarter while veterans are facing eviction here at home?" He froze. No teleprompter, no aide whispering, just silence. Karoline, watching from her team's office, said nothing. She didn't have to. America had seen enough. Then came the petition. It started small, just a link in a tweet from a Gold Star mother Karoline had visited. But within 48 hours, over 500,000 signatures had poured in. Demand answers. Demand accountability. Demand action. The nation wasn't just listening anymore. It was rising. And at the center of it all stood Karoline. Unapologetic, relentless, and fueled by the people who had been forgotten for too long. She hadn't planned a revolution. But she had just lit the match. The sun rose over a Capitol still reeling from the aftershocks of Karoline's stand. Her name wasn't just trending. It was etched into the political bloodstream. Us border truth. Karoline was right, and the brutal echoing chant from the streets. You cried for the 6th, but not for the 6-year-old. Jeffries canceled his next appearance, but Karoline showed up in Texas, El Paso, right on the edge of everything Washington avoided. She didn't stand on a stage. She stood in dirt beside a torn chain-link fence where residents had laid down teddy bears, crosses, and American flags, each representing a child whose life had been